Hello, I'm Julia Bell, and I've been for the last 8 years running the MA in Creative Writing at Birkbeck College. And I'm very pleased to welcome here for the Arts Week special event, Melissa Febos and Lily Dunn. And we're going to be talking about the radical power of personal narrative. And just to give you a quick introduction, Melissa is the author of the critically acclaimed memoir Whip Smart and essay collections Abandon Me, which has been a finalist for many awards, the Lambda Award, Publishing Triangle Award, and it was named as Best Book of the Year of 2017. And her second essay collection, which is fantastic, I can attest, called Girlhood, was a finalist for the 2021 National Book Critics Circle Award. And now this book, Bodyworks, which is an essay, a polemic, perhaps, on the radical power of personal narrative, which Alexander Chee calls one of the most liberating books on the subject of writing that I can think of. So something that we're joined up here to hopefully discuss in a lot more detail. And also joining us is Lily Dunn, or should I say Dr. Lily Dunn. Congratulations, Lily. Lily is an author and a mentor, and her latest book, Sins of My Father, is a literary memoir about her enduring love for a delinquent father, described by Marina Benjamin as a necessary, brilliant, brave book. Her essays have appeared in Granta, Hinterland, Litro, and The Real Story, and she's a regular writer for the international Aeon magazine. Lily teaches narrative nonfiction at Bath Spa University, and she also co-runs London Lit Lab with her friend and author Zoe Gilbert. So these are our two writers that are talking with me today. And I think the first question I really want to address, which is kind of what we're here to talk about, is why memoir? I know that Lily's written fiction before, but I think you found your voice really in your memoir work. And Melissa, you've made a career from writing personal narratives. So really, I want to know what the appeal is of working with real events rather than creating imagined ones. So perhaps Melissa can pick up on that.
Yeah, happy to. It's a great question. And, I also started out writing fiction. My MFA is in fiction writing, and there was no great appeal for me, ostensibly in the beginning, for writing from personal experience. I was sort of repelled by the idea, actually. It sounded embarrassing and scary, and like people would judge me and not take me seriously. And all of those things are like a little bit true, it turns out. But mostly what I found when I actually started doing it is that the constraint of writing about things that actually happened, wherein I can use my memories, my emails, and documents, the other people in my life as primary sources, is unexpectedly liberating for me. When I write fiction, the onus of invention, I'm a I'm a Libra. I struggle with decision making. I deliberate for a really long time. And when I have to invent whole cloth of the world of fiction, I move very, very slowly. And the constraint of nonfiction, where there are a lot of possibilities, but the material is finite. It's what happened to me. It's what I can research. It is what my interviews yield. And then I have that sort of lump of clay, right? And I have to make insight out of it. I have to make understanding out of it. I have to make art out of it. It has to be, to a certain extent, pleasurable for the reader. It gives it a kind of puzzle-like quality that I mean, I love puzzles. And so that boundaried nature of it just makes it easier to sort of run toward for me and to puzzle over. Yeah. So I think that's probably the shortest answer to that I have.
No, that's a really interesting. There's so many things I want to come back to in that answer. But yeah, Lily, what's your journey?
I would agree with that, Melissa. I'm also a Libra, so maybe that is a Libra thing. But I think I agree with that. It makes, well, I think also for me, it just always was a natural thing that I did. I mean, I wrote fiction because that's what's expected of you, isn't it? It's like you say, you might want to write from life, but you're not really encouraged to do that. And particularly if you do an MA, when I did an MA in my 20s, and there wasn't really an option to write. Well, there certainly wasn't an option to write memoir. You wouldn't have an option to write personal narrative. So you're channeled into fiction writing. But as Julia said, I sort of found my voice in nonfiction. And I think actually what I realized was that I had always been writing it through journaling. And so, you're kind of nurturing that reflective voice that feels very natural to you. So when you realize that you can actually do that through writing memoir or personal narrative, and it's something that just feels, you know, that the personal first person I pronoun, you know, it's actually really liberating, because and also the realization that you it might appear that you're writing what's already there, but actually what you're doing with it, it's always a challenge, isn't it, as a personal narrative writer, to do something new or imaginative or interesting with that material. So I think it's no less challenging to write personal narrative, it's just very different.
It seems to be having a bit of a moment at the moment, kind of personal non-fiction. I mean, is that true? I mean, you said when, and it's certainly true when I did my MA, that it was the novel that everybody was expected to write. And I wonder why that is, or why everybody puts the novel as the place that can hold all of these ideas, when it seems to me non-fiction can also carry those kinds of feelings. Is there a reason why memoir, why now, do you think?
I mean, I think we could talk about that for a long time. And I do think it's having a moment. And I think part of it is because we are in kind of a moment of, at least within certain sort of political spheres, it's a moment of testimony, right? It's a moment where personal experience, where identity, where the great events of our lives are being cast in a political context. And so there is a new argument for its relevancy to a larger audience. Whereas before, I think personal narrative, the events of a person's individual life were cast as very female, domestic, small, and were therefore in a patriarchal society devalued and thought of as just for a certain kind of audience, or just for pleasure reading, or indulgent, or something. And now that the personal has been, you know, for feminists, the personal has always been politicized, but now on a much larger stage and across gender, I think it's been politicized. And so people are sort of have been given license to take it seriously. And I think also what Lily and I both said about, once you start doing it, the creative puzzle of it, combined with the psychological, spiritual, personal, social rewards of doing so, like the clarity that comes out of it when you are just not sort of cloaking it in invention in any way and really addressing your own deep questions, it's incredibly compelling, right? So I think once people start doing it, they're like, whoa, I know so many poets and fiction writers who are like, I'm writing a memoir. And because they felt like they were sort of allowed to, and then they realized how interesting it is.
Yeah, I get the best work from my MA students out of the non-fiction class. I almost every year, without fail. What about you, Lily? Do you think, what about the moment?
Well, I mean, I guess it's, I mean, some people would say that the moment was in the 90s, wasn't it? I mean, it was like a massive kind of surge in the 90s. And it feels in the UK that we're still catching up with that. You know, it was a big thing in America, and there's been more snobbery, or I've sensed more snobbery here, or more resistance. And I wonder if that's to do with America having more of an open confessional culture. You know, that here we're a little bit more stuck up, we're a bit more old-fashioned, maybe. But yes, I mean, it does seem to be everywhere. And I don't know if that's because I'm kind of following loads of memoirists on Twitter, but yeah, a lot of publishers are publishing it right now. I mean, to me, it's also about, it is that confessional culture, but it's taking it a step further into the literary realm, isn't it? Where it's not just confession for confession's sake, it's actually it's interrogating, it's asking questions, it's asking difficult questions underneath the answers. You know, it's sort of turning things upside down and saying, no, we're not prepared to be happy with the answers or the family myths, the things that we've lived with and accepted. We want to go deeper than that, and maybe that comes from a kind of lack of trust, you know, a lack of trust with what's being given to us, that we want to test it and we want to challenge it. I mean, for me, the most interesting and inspiring memoirs are those that sort of expand and grow before your eyes, that you get a sense that the writer is discovering something about themselves in the process of writing it. And I felt that about your book, Whip Smart, Melissa. It really had that sense of that you were transcending the material almost, you know, through that process of really kind of addressing and looking at your life from a different perspective. You were growing through that. And and it brings a work alive, I think, for readers, and I think they then sort of transform through the process of reading, you know, and I think that's very powerful. I guess novels do that as well, but maybe there's something about memoir that's more direct. It's more, you know, we're sort of chasing a wisdom, we're chasing an understanding.
Yeah, there really is a power to knowing that there is an actual person, you know, even though I think just as much truth exists within like emotional truth, life truth, and maybe personal truth in between novels and memoirs, but there is like a testimonial power to knowing this is a real person who lived this. Therefore, I can prove that I am not alone in this experience, that it's possible to question the explanations that I was given, right? And I think you're so right. I sort of grew up during the surge of memoirs here, and it was like Frank McCourt and Mary Karr, and I feel like the American reading audience was like, oh wait, memoirs can read just like novels. And now it's more of that sort of politicized interrogation of ideas, and there's all these memoirs with research in them now, and including, you know, I think both of our work is asking very explicit questions about experience and understanding and relationships. And it's a genre that really sort of straddles lots of different realms of meaning seeking.
So this kind of brings me to a question about process and about sort of, you know, take a step back from the books you've published. And this big question, which has been actually blowing up on my Twitter feed this week, about shame. I have a friend who's writing a memoir at the moment, and she said she keeps throwing up on it and putting it away because she feels so ashamed of it. And I know that feeling from my own work in writing memoir. What can I say? What can't I say? Feeling ashamed of your fear. How do you get to the point of actually getting to put yourself on the page? I mean, the liberation that has created, I think, for both of you in your work has opened the floodgates in terms of what you feel like you're capable of now. But at some point, there was this hurdle that you had to get over. How did you navigate that?
Yeah, I definitely, you know, there's this misconception about memoirists that I'm sure both of you are familiar with, that we are sort of the barfly who's willing to tell everyone all of our secrets, you know, to any stranger, that we're kind of oversharers who like attention. And I think it's actually much more often the opposite, that we are deeply private, secretive people who are terrified of being seen and want to keep everybody happy. And my experience, I was like in therapy this morning talking about this with my therapist, how even as a child, when things were hard for me or I was encountering something unpleasant, my instinct was always to bury it and to not let anyone see and to just keep smiling and keep it moving. And my experience has been that instinct for secrecy and extreme privacy and managing other people's impressions of me, while there is a satisfaction in it, it creates a tremendous pressure psychologically. And so at the time when I wrote my first memoir, when I sort of switched to nonfiction, there was this incredible pressure in me. There were things that I needed to talk about, wanted to understand, wanted to fit into some kind of narrative, but I had never talked to anyone about it. And so it wasn't possible. I can't do that kind of work alone in my head. And so once I broke the seal and gave myself permission to put words to it, it was like the floodgates opened. I've never had a writing experience like that before. And I had this immediate understanding of how important it is for me in terms of my own thought process and relationship to my experience to put words to it, right? And so I think for me, in order to sort of get over that shame and to write through it, I have to make myself a very sincere promise at the beginning of every writing project, because they all have shame for me. That's part of why I'm writing about them, that I never have to show it to anyone, that I can keep it, I can maintain the privacy of that page for as long as I want to, for forever if I want to. And the alchemy of writing in this genre for me is that by the time I'm finished, whether it's weeks or years later, the writing process has released me from the shame, right? And so
process of managing shame, writing in its own way is a process of managing the shame.
Yeah,
I really relate to that. And actually there's that brilliant Annie Ernaux quote about, you know, don't worry about it, don't worry about it, just write it, because by the time it's going to come out, you know, you might have died, or the people you're writing about might have died. And, you know, think about that in 3 years' time. And I think that's absolutely, you've nailed it there, Melissa, because it's the various degrees of separation that you go through in yourself in the writing process, and then the editing process, and then the waiting to be published process that helps you objectify that material, and it becomes something that you can hold and then give as a gift to the world. And that, and I guess in the process of writing, you could say you need to have enough distance from your material to do it justice as well, because we've all been there when we've been too close to the material and it's not quite working, it's too literal, or it's not coming alive. And so, but that in itself is a kind of writing process, isn't it? That you put it away in the drawer, you come back to it, you think about it, you're constantly checking in with yourself, you're checking in with those people you're writing about, those people that you love and care for. And so, you know, it's a matter of feeling the shame and doing it anyway, and purging it, and then coming back and having distance and allowing yourself the discomfort. Actually, I think I've learned that a lot through writing memoir. Even the discomfort that can come from people that you're writing about, that can be really frightening and really awful to go through, but the outcome can actually be quite surprising, that actually perhaps you've transcended something in your relationship with that person, or you've helped them face something that they hadn't seen before. You know, you've started a conversation that perhaps wouldn't have been there otherwise. And so there is that sense of courage. You know, you do have to have the courage to stick with it and believe that it's going to come good. You know, I mean, not for everybody. I know that it's different.
Vivian Gornick talks about it in The Situation and the Story as well, about the thing that you've come into the room to say, and that she loves writing that shows you how the writer comes to the moments of realization that they come to at the end of the book. So you're kind of both saying that the integrity of a piece of creative nonfiction, or good piece of memoir writing, really is about the approach that the writer takes to the thing that they're looking at, and actually interrogating the gap between you and that thing that you're looking at is actually part of the subject of the writing, or it should be in some way. It's not just a sort of exploitative misery memoir. It's actually something about, what does this mean? What did this situation, what did this, it's a working out of the many meanings of an event.
And
yeah,
also,
that's exactly.
Sorry, I was just going to say, what does the shame mean? You know, it's naming the shame even, and looking at the shame, and, you know, which is what we all experience. It's a common shame. So not shying away from that. Sorry, Melissa.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I was just going to add that I think that's where a lot of the misconceptions about memoir come in. And you know that they're from people who don't read memoir, because it's so obvious that, you know, a lot of what I hear from my students who are afraid of writing memoir, or even interviewers when my first book came out, is this impression that memoir is a transcript of memory, or a transcript of experience, or I'm just telling you about the things that happened, when it's like, things happen to everyone. My story isn't inherently more interesting than anyone else's. Everyone goes through trauma and change and loss and all of the stuff that we write about in memoir. But it is that using the craft, the tools of art making and of literary work as a mediator to derive meaning from what happened, and to sort of demonstrate and model the process of learning from experience, right? And coming to a new idea about oneself and the world that one lives in. And so I think if memoir is a transcript, it's a transcript of that process, which is basically what both of you were saying.
Yeah, it's about the quality of the gaze. I think what I'm looking for in a good piece of memoir is how deep and how clearly is somebody able to tell me about the things that they know and that have happened to them. And that, for me, is what makes something really good. But how do we deal with this issue that perhaps not just about our own shame, but dealing with the people that we might want to write about? Because obviously, Lily, in your case, it was your father, and in Melissa, you write about your clients, and in your other Abandon Me, you write about your childhood. And, you know, how do you approach people's identity? And, you know, if someone's treated us badly, do we have the right to write about them? I mean, I wrestled a long time with that with Hymnal. That's why it took me 10 years to put it out in the world, because I was shy of showing it to my parents, I guess. But I don't know, how do we deal with the people that we write about?
Yeah.
I think it's really tricky, and this is something that I come up against a lot in my teaching, that it actually stops people from writing. You know,
Yeah, it
they're
does.
really, really driven to something, and it's burning up inside them, and they just won't do it because of the fear of how it's going to affect people. And I used to say we're all entitled to our story, and I'm not sure that I still stick to that, because all our stories blend with other stories. And so there is a responsibility that we have to those people who are affected by our story. Um, it's really tricky. I think it's really down to, I mean, from my own experience, I think it's down to the individual circumstances of any relationship. So in my case, you know, my dad had died. There is an argument that it was unethical of me to have imagined his life after his death when he couldn't defend himself. And there are sections in my memoir where I actually go into scenes where I wasn't actually there, that I didn't witness, which is also ethically tricky. But I think in my case, you know, my voice was very, very repressed by him, suppressed. You know, my entire life before he died was affected by his behavior and his betrayal and his abuse. And so it was a political act for me to stand up and find my voice and find the authority to be able to also tell his story. So in that case, I think I kind of justified it, because it was a final act for me. You know, it was an act of liberation. But I think it's incredibly complex when people do write about other people. I mean, I don't know, Melissa, what do you feel about it? It's really tricky, isn't it? I don't know that I have an
Yeah.
answer to it.
It sounds like you and I have had a similar trajectory, where I think when I started out, even when I was writing Whip Smart, which was the least complicated of my books in some ways, because it was really my story, you know, and I definitely disguised everyone who was in it, to like legally protect myself and to protect their privacy. But I think I was really comforted at that time by writers. Anne Lamott has a quote that's something like, people wanted to come off good in your memoir, they should have acted better. And Mary Karr, I did a reading with Mary Karr last year, and someone asked us this, and I gave a long, thoughtful response, and Mary Karr said, I tell them, write your own damn book. It's like, okay. I mean, I wish that I could get on board with that, but I've experienced too much at this point. You know, I think, as you said, Lily, it depends what the story is, right? If something, my sort of ethical code has evolved such that if a story is bigger in someone else's life, and I don't have a really compelling reason for doing so, like the one you just described, then it might not be mine to write, right? Or I might want to ask their permission or figure out a path to it that person would not be harmed by, you know. And I was not doing that early on. If it's my story and it implicates someone and in an unflattering light, it really depends. Like, do I have an ongoing relationship with that person that I'd like to preserve? Have I scrutinized my own complicity and behavior more so than them or any other character in my book? Because that's the standard I hold myself to, not in a self-flagellating way, but in a clear seeing, implicating way, right? That's trying to like exercise humility and not grandiosity in either direction. Because I've written about abusive past partners in ways that they were enraged by, and I still feel okay about it because I adhered to my code. You know, it's not possible to keep everyone happy, and it's not possible to have every person out there approve of the decisions that one makes as an artist. But I do believe that it's our duty to define our own moral code and to abide by it, and to be willing for it to evolve based on experience. You know, I've really learned the hard way a few times how it feels to hurt people that I love, right? Or even to hurt people unnecessarily that I don't love, you know, and it's made me a much more sensitive and rigorous sort of person when navigating these kinds of situations.
Yeah, it's interesting the use of the word rigor, which I think is also something that I would put into anybody's literary dictionary, because that's what I want my students to show, whatever they're writing, is a kind of rigor with language. And I think that when we hurt someone by mistake, it's usually the rigor, the language is sloppy, or there's something there that we didn't interrogate. I think that idea of interrogating one's own point of view as well, I think is very crucial. But the word that you've both mentioned, which brings me to the next question in a way, is about publishing and taking this to, we've gone through the process of getting rid of the shame. We've dealt with the characters that we're writing about. How do we take something then into the big kind of commercial world and sort of talk about it and read from it, and the way in which the world of commerce wants to take our stories and kind of peddle it in a particular kind of way. Particularly both of you have written about subjects that I think are quite sensitive in various ways. You've written about your sexuality, you've written about your dad in the cult, the things that I know the mainstream media will pick up and sort of churn into sort of tabloidese. How do we deal with that, and how do we deal with taking it public, being public in the world with our stories?
Melissa, do you want to answer that
Sure.
first?
Yeah, this is another area where I've really learned a lot over the course of my 4 books. In the beginning, I think with my first book, I was pretty unprepared. And it wasn't until I was, on national radio being asked really rude questions that I was like,
Right.
oh, wait,
Yeah.
I have to, in addition to having written a book, I have to become an expert at navigating offensive questions.
Right.
And maintaining my own boundaries and figuring out what those are. And so I think any memoirist, but particularly women, are absolute ninjas at evading rude questions and answering any question with whatever it is they feel like talking about. You could ask me a question, aren't you ashamed of sharing this detail about your life? And I would be like, that's really interesting, because the subject of embarrassment comes into Act 3 of the book in this interesting way, and just completely parlay to whatever it is I want to talk about. And I mean, buried in that comment is the fact that I've realized, which is that I don't, just because I've written a book about something doesn't mean that I have to answer every question that's asked of me. I don't have to talk about anything I don't want to, and I'm fine saying, next question, and sort of moving on with it. Right. And I think, going public with this personal stuff will teach you really, really quickly what it means to sort of separate yourself from the work. And where I've come to with that is that my job, my number one job, is a writer. And once I've written the book, the biggest part of my job is over, right? And of course, I want to speak for that book and frame people's thinking about it and give it the best chance of finding a wide readership. But I get a lot, as I'm sure you do, Lily, I get a lot of emails from readers who've had similar experiences, or people that find my work offensive, or people that have extra questions or want me to read their unpublished manuscript. And I file them in a certain folder in my email, and I get to it when I can, if I feel like it. And that's just, if I didn't think about it that way, I would never write another book. I would only be a person who answers emails, So I've really learned how to protect my own integrity in my space and to not answer anything that feels intrusive or disrespectful.
Yeah.
And I think it does come back to that question, doesn't it? That when you write memoir, people want to know, they want to dig into the content, and they're not really asking you questions about the craft. Whereas when you write fiction, you're often asked questions about the craft. And actually what we're trying to do as writers of good memoir, not just sort of scandalous misery memoir or celebrity memoir, is we are drawing attention to the craft, and we need to continue that conversation, because this is all still quite new for people who aren't used to seeing memoir as part of the literary canon. That actually, the same decisions have gone into it. Characterization and structure and story and setting and everything that you would do in a novel. And you're absolutely right. If they're asking you about the content, you just direct them to the book. They can read the book again. That it's all there. So why do we need to churn over the same stuff? The other thing I would just bring back to is, I just thought your answer to the previous question was so brilliant, in terms of, if the story is bigger than the the people who are involved in that story, then that can be part of your code of practice. And I think that this also comes back to this question as well, that if you have written something that is important to talk about, you talk about the politics around that. You don't need you can detract from the personal. You can talk about the bigger issue, the thing that's actually going to be helpful to people. And that's how I've learned. I mean, the only bit of bad publicity I had was the Telegraph interview, which was just, it was lovely in practice, but what was printed was not really what was discussed. And it was just going for all the sex and abuse and kind of single mother. It was full of cliches. And I was sorry about that, but I just filed it away and I didn't look at it again.
Yeah, that's really on them, and that's on the climate and not on the book, I think. Two things come out of those answers for me. Was first of that thing that Leslie Jameson says about using your life as evidence for argument, which seems to me to be perhaps the best code for any kind of memoir writing, is that you've got a bigger point to make than just to narrate the thing that happened. You can actually understand it, which brings me to the second point, which is that in a way, you don't want the reader to be in the psychiatrist's chair analysing you as the writer. You want to have done the analysis already for the reader, so that when they're reading the book, they're in your experience as you're kind of digesting it and thinking it through. And that therefore is the pleasure, or the plot line, or the through line of the piece of writing, is seeing that argument playing out. So I guess the next question then is to think about technique and kind of this artfulness that we keep discussing or talking about, craft. You've got a chapter in Bodywork on writing good sex, Melissa, so I'm curious to know about your thoughts on that, and perhaps on why we should do that. But then also more broadly, what do you think are the kind of key components to a great piece of writing? What's the craft?
Right. I mean, I spent a whole semester studying about this. It's my favorite subject. So, as I'm sure is true for Lily and for you. Yeah, but I would say, I wrote that essay about writing sex, partly because I think it's important for us to deal with it frankly and directly, but primarily because people get so distracted by the content. And this goes back to something that Lily very smartly said earlier about how people get so distracted by the content of memoir, and they neglect to recognize that it is employing, in most cases, all the same elements of craft that fiction does, plus some other extra, more reflective, analytical, researched elements in a lot of cases. It's like a highly, highly crafted form when it's done well, obviously. And I think sex is a great way to talk about that, because I can't tell you how many students or peers I've heard say, oh, sex is so hard to write about. And it's like, no, your feelings about sex are hard to write through, but the writing is the same as every other kind of writing. And for me, there is an enormous relief in that. Like, the art of it is the thing that makes it possible. I could never just write a transcript of the worst things that have ever happened to me and release it into the world. There would be no point in that. But the mediation of it, of encountering those experiences and analyzing them using plot, narrative tension, images, characterization, dialogue, all of the stuff, it gives me a distance from it, that distance that Lily was also talking about, so that I can see it with a little bit of objectivity, which is impossible when I'm just recollecting my life. I'm not thinking of it as content. I'm not thinking of it as a subject that I'm going to approach as an artist. And so I think all of those tools, a subject might feel emotionally hot when I first start writing about it. And it is the tools of writing that I pick up and sort of like, oh, okay, I can touch it with that. I can't just like put my face right up into it, but I can think about what an effective image system for this experience. How do I transmit the physical experience of fear to a reader, right? It's a technical question. It's not an emotional question, right? I have to source my own emotions, but like you were saying about Leslie's wonderful analogy for that, like I can use it as a primary source or as evidence for making an argument or for illuminating a human experience to another person that's legible. So I could talk about this forever. I love it.
Yeah, and digging deep into oneself as well. You know, I think that comes into this as well. Absolutely what you say, Julia, about, you know, you doing the hard work yourself, you finding that wisdom and then sharing it like as a gift. You know, it becomes a gift to the reader. And memoir, the interesting memoir to me is memoir by authors who are prepared to go to difficult places in themselves. You know, they're emotionally prepared, and that in itself is a process, isn't it? And you know, you've probably gone through quite a lot of that process before you sit down at the computer and even start. So I would say that the technique extends to one's own wisdom and one's own preparedness to go there, actually. And I think that's what differentiates memoir from fiction, is that sort of that preparedness to expose parts of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
What about
Mm-hmm.
structure? Because I know that Lily with Sins, I saw it, I was lucky enough to sort of work with you as it developed, but you know, you wrote a few essays from it and then it became a book, and then you know, you put it back together again and you put it together in a new way. It took a while to sort of reach its form. And Melissa, you've written across both the memoir as a lot and essays. So, you know, how do you distinguish between something that's going to be a long book and something that's just going to work as a short piece? I think structure comes up a lot in the workshops as a question. How do I structure this, or what, you know?
For me, it was very much a kind of a process that needed to take time, I think. And I think maybe that's that preparedness again, that you kind of have to, well, for me anyway, and with this book, it may be different with future books, but I had to get ready to to understand what it is that I was trying to do. And sometimes that can just take years, and because you're kind of living it while you're writing it as well. So yeah, it for me, I can't really force that. And I mean, at the moment, I'm trying to go into a new book through a proposal, so I'm trying to structure it a little bit while writing it, and it feels like quite an unnatural way of writing memoir. I'd be interested to know what you've done with yours, Melissa. Has it been different with different books?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I It's always revealed. I just have to be sort of talking to the project and the material, by which I mean writing and thinking about it and reading around it for long enough that it reveals itself to me. I don't know. Most things start off as an essay. The current book I'm working on, which is my first full-length memoir since Whip Smart, it started out as what I thought would be an essay in girlhood, my previous collection. But I started writing it, and it actually became clear really early. I was like, oh, I am just scratching the surface of this. You know, I actually have so much more to say, and I need to understand so much more, that there's no way this is going to fit in an essay or in this book, in fact. So I sort of transplanted it into a bigger pot and set it aside until I had written body work and published 2 books. And then I came back to it and was like, are you still alive? And it was like, I am. So and with that one, I also wrote a proposal and sold it on proposal. And that, I agree, is an unnatural experience that can facilitate the writing process. And in other cases, sometimes it can impede the writing process. I think it's like, for me, I think a lot of this supposed Michelangelo quote where he was talking about sculpture and said something to the effect of, I saw the angel in the stone and I carved to set him free. And I think for me, it feels very much like I reveal a little bit of the shape of it, and then I can intuit a little further, and then a little bit more, and a little further. And sometimes when the full shape of the thing becomes visible, it's terrifying because I wasn't planning on writing a book, you know. But there it is. It turns out I have a lot more to say on it, but it usually takes a good amount of writing and that kind of preparedness that Lily's talking about before I figure it out.
Do you approach your research? I mean, in terms of what you think you need to know about the topic. I mean, do you set yourself a kind of parameter in which you're going to, you know, say, okay, so I know it's going to be in this area. These are the things I need to know. How do you figure that out or address
I
that?
wish it was that direct. It's much more exhaustive and exhausting than that. When I'm interested in something like the essays in girlhood, for instance, or the book I'm working on now, I know I don't know enough to do it real justice, that there's more I want to figure out to inform my own analysis. So I cast a really wide net. And that means having conversations with people, conducting interviews, getting on the library website, reading scholarly articles, reading popular articles, watching documentaries and movies. And I just sort of like am living and breathing that subject for a while, but I'm usually writing while I'm doing that. And those two processes, it's like things start to spark.
Yeah.
Right. And the things that I get really excited about in the research start to inform the writing, and the things that I discover in the writing start to narrow my research until there's a bibliography. And then like 10% of that gets referenced in the work, and most of it is just up here.
Yeah, no, that's exactly how we kind of teach the PhD about
Yeah,
that kind of combination of research, reading and writing.
that was my
Oh,
process.
I'm so glad.
Yeah, that was definitely my process on the PhD. So yeah,
the reading that you did deepened the book, and every layer of reading, and then every layer of writing was different from the one before, because the reading had gone on to inform it. I think it's a really interesting question with nonfiction, because you do become your own autodidact in a way. You're setting your own parameters and so on, but you want it to have had enough depth so that you don't get someone coming in and going, oh, you didn't read that book about, this classic thing that you should have known about, that would have given you an extra point of view.
Right. And then there's always that.
Sorry.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, and then there's that point where you have to just accept that someone is probably going to say that, and or something's going to be published before it comes out that you're like, oh no, because I could write any book for a whole lifetime if I don't stop myself at a certain point.
And actually, that is the joy of memoir, is that it's narrow, its focus is narrowed through your experience. So you can get away with missing out quite a few chunks of research.
Yes, absolutely. And you can still justify it as it's still your point of view. But I do think that a certain level of kind of philosophical and psychological and general reading just always improves the work, because it gives you more knowledge, more things to know. How can that not help? Could you just finish up? Thank you so much. We could carry on, but I think for the sake of the timekeeping, we should draw to a close soon. But could you both just recommend to me some great books that you've been reading recently, some good nonfiction that maybe the people that are watching this might be able to go off and read, as well as your own books, of course. But
yeah, Melissa, do you want to go first?
I do. I actually just finished sort of binging Deborah Levy's living autobiography, and I loved it. I absolutely, I just think she is a beautiful writer, and I found them so funny. And so I really enjoyed those. And I also recently listened to Zadie Smith's, two British writers. That's funny. Zadie Smith is better known for her fiction, but she is one of my favorite living essayists. And I just read her little sort of pandemic book called Intimations, which is just a skinny little essay collection. But I can't, Feel Free, her collection from some years ago, is just magnificent. So, one more. There's a US writer, an Indigenous writer named Alyssa Washuta, who published a book in 2021 called White Magic, an essay collection that is really experimental and highly researched and very political and funny, and it's beautiful.
Cool, thank you.
I'm well, Melissa, sorry, not Melissa Vivas. I could, of course, recommend you, Melissa Vivas, but Marina Benjamin is a massive influence on my work, and she's got a new memoir, the final of maybe the final, the third of her trilogy. Yeah, A Little Give. You've got it there, yeah.
Right here on my desk.
What I love about her work, it's actually there's a grantor essay which I have used in my teaching, which I just think is extraordinary, which is Personal Growth, which you can access online. She's a brilliant writer because she's got all the humane element of writing memoir, but also she's very intellectual in her approach. She structures things beautifully. But also what I think is really interesting about A Little Give is it's about the silent work that women do, cleaning. It came out of the pandemic, cleaning and caring and feeding. And what I find, again, so liberating about this kind of memoir is that we all do these things. And actually, when we write about them, we're making those things the drudgery of the everyday or the plainness of the everyday into something generative, and it makes sense of what we do, of what we have been landed with. And I think that's a very kind of powerful political thing to do, a very personal political thing to do. So I really recommend Marina's work. And then just lastly, also Amy Key, I think, is an interesting new writer, and she's got Arrangements in Blue coming out this week. And that stemmed from a Granter essay. And again, it's just that kind of bravery and courage to write about, I mean, she's writing about being a single woman and not being in a romantic relationship, and her longing for a romantic relationship. And it's all based around Joni Mitchell's Blue album. So it's structured around the songs from the Blue album, which I think is a great idea. But also just that willingness to go to really difficult personal places, you know, and put yourself on the line like that. I admire that in a writer. So yeah, and she writes beautifully. She's a poet.
Fantastic, thank you. I've been meaning to get that. It's on my radar. I think there's some really interesting things happening with form in the sort of creative nonfiction memoir field at the moment. Lots of people doing interesting cut-ups or scrapbook styles, or using a kind of different kind of containing principle than just doing a linear narrative, which I think is really interesting. Thank you both. Melissa, you said you'd close us out by giving us a short extract from Bodywork, which is here. I can show you my Manchester University Press.
Oh, it's such a beautiful book. I love the artwork on the UK version. I'm gonna read from my American edition, and I'm just gonna read just a couple pages at the very end of the first essay, which is called "In Praise of Navel Gazing." I don't mean to argue that writing personally is for everyone. What I'm saying is, don't avoid yourself. The story that comes calling might be your own, and it might not go away if you don't open the door. I don't believe in writer's block. I only believe in fear. And you can be afraid and still write something. No one has to read it, though when you're done, you might want them to. One of the epigraphs of my second book, though it could be an epigraph for my life, is a quote from the British psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott. It is joy to be hidden and disaster not to be found. Almost everything I've ever written started with a secret, with the fear that my subject was unspeakable. Without exception, writing about these subjects has not only freed me from fear, but from the subjects themselves, and from the bondage of believing I might be alone in them. What I have also observed is that avoiding a secret subject can be its own kind of bondage. To William H. Gass's argument, to have written an autobiography is already to have made yourself a monster, I say that refusing to write your story can make you into a monster. Or perhaps, more accurately, we are already monsters, and to deny the monstrous is to deny its beauty, its meaning, its necessary devastation. Transforming my secrets into art has transformed me. I believe that stories like these have the power to transform the world. That is the point of literature, or at least that's what I tell my students. We are writing the history that we could not find in any book. We are telling the stories that no one else can tell, and we are giving this proof of our survival to each other. And I'll stop there.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. That was a really, really fascinating
Thank you both.
conversation.